Good afternoon, how are you guys?
Great.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it, and I hope everybody can hear me. And I also want everybody to know that I owe KT a bottle of New York wine, Hudson Valley wine, for what a nice intro, so thank you. I'm not sure I deserve that. But at any rate, I wanted to thank you guys for taking the time out of your farms and out of your busy days and your schedules for coming here today and talking about agriculture. When I thought about what I wanted to say, I thought about one of the things that's most important in my work, which is trying to bridge the divide, the ever-increasing divide, frankly, between our farmers and our consumers and our policymakers in New York State. It's really important that we start engaging at a whole new level if we're going to be able to succeed. So, I want to talk a little bit about our farm community. And again, 10 years ago, this whole conference would certainly never have happened. But about a couple of years ago, I was very intrigued by a group of teachers that did a survey of their kids. And they asked their kids, well, what is the coolest occupation that you can think of? And what's the coolest occupation that these kids came up with?
Farmers.
Farmers, right? So farmers are cool right now. And you can tell that in part by the interest of talking about farming and agricultural issues right now. And I always start off with this spiel with my farmer members by telling them they're cool, because a lot of times they get very discouraged in this particular state. So when we talk about how farmers are cool people right now, we have such a great interest in the local farms, local foods movement, which is so exciting to us who have been in agriculture for a long time. I'm not sure where KT put posters out, but I did bring some local food, local farms posters. So if you have an interest in having one of those, you're welcome to grab them as you exit, I think. So we finally seem to see in agriculture today and in our state that we have benefits to really keeping land in agriculture. And about 10 years ago, when I talked to a non-farm audience about how important our farmers were, the biggest benefit that I stressed to having farmland wasn't even food, because 10 years ago we didn't care as much about local food. 10 years ago we cared a lot more about the environmental benefits of our farmland. So it's really interesting to me to see how this local food, local farm movement has brought together environmentalists and the foodie groups together to talk about why agriculture is important. And of course we have the all-important economic tie as well. We have in New York State this wonderful potential, and I know Todd and I have talked about it many times over the years, to really link our farm families directly with the consumers, or as one of my favorite farmer members say, the eaters in New York State who want to eat New York State grown products. One of the other things that is interesting today about today's farm economy, where we've changed from 10 years ago, is that we have a lot more women coming into agriculture. So the fastest growing segment in New York agriculture today is actually women-owned farms, which as a woman, I obviously think that's pretty cool. We also have a lot more young farmers trying to get into the business today than ever before, but there are significant challenges and hurdles to that. We have some really great news that has helped increase the coolness quotient of our New York farms, in that Governor Cuomo has been doing yogurt summits. Everybody loves Greek yogurt, right? He's also been doing these wine summits. Wine, I have to remember all my categories now: wine, beer, distillates, and cider. So that's been fun. We have a great opportunity in the Regional Economic Development Councils, and as I see listings of projects that have been awarded, it's been nice to see how many farm economic development projects we've seen. We also have had some really good regulatory changes in recent years. And this is one of the things that we've worked on a lot. The picture on the PowerPoint, I don't know how clear it is for you guys, but that gentleman in the picture, his name is Derek Hickling. He's our Otsego County Farm Bureau president. 10 years ago, he was a dairy farmer. Today, he's a fish farmer. And one of the things that New York Farm Bureau did is we worked on this issue for 6 years. Now you realize how long it takes us to get something done, right? So it took us 6 years to change a DEC regulation, which we were able to do under Commissioner Martens and Governor Cuomo, which finally allowed fish farms in New York State to sell black bass in New York City markets, in New York State markets. So because of this regulatory change, which just happened on January 1st, that gentleman right there, and that's his dad behind him, former dairy farmer, wanted to keep his land open. He is now shipping about 4,000 pounds of fish to New York City a week and has plans to double that next year. So really exciting small changes in regulation that we've been able to get, again, largely because our farmers right now are poor. So as I thought again about what I wanted to share with you though, not just again the coolness quotient of New York farmers, but also that as I talk to our farmers, and I do this a lot more than I speak to audiences like this regularly, no matter where I go in the state, whether it's Long Island, whether it's the Hudson Valley, whether it's Central New York or the North Country, or out in Western New York, as I talk to my members, I hear more and more stress that's in their voice and in their concerns for their farm operations for the future. And in order to figure out why farmers are so stressed right now, so that we can try to help them a little bit better, we have to take a look at New York's farming scene. So I don't know how much you've thought about agriculture in New York State as a whole. We have 36,000 farms. This is both good news and bad news. It's good news because that number is unchanged from 2011. So we take some pride and some comfort in thinking this is great. Our overall farm numbers in 1 year stayed the same. When we look at national farm numbers during that same period, we have seen some losses in farms. We have 7 million acres in farmland in New York State, and our average farm size is still 194 acres. Again, very different from some other of our farm states. We've seen an encouraging amount of growth in our largest sales classes of farms and our medium sales classes of farms. By this, I'm talking about their revenue, not their acreage or how many cows they have, but their revenue. But where we see the most stress in our New York State's farm sector right now is the very small farms. So last year, while we saw some growth in our farm members, we also lost 900 farms that had sales between 1,000 and 10,000 a year. So this is, again, those people who are just getting into agriculture and finding it difficult to remain in agriculture. One of the wonderful things about New York agriculture is that 99% of our New York farms are family-owned. A lot of people always think about farms and think, you know what, I like farms, but I don't like it when they form corporations. So I want to tell you guys that even if a farm is a corporate entity, the odds are great, at least in New York, that it's still a family farm. They've just incorporated their business, which realistically is a very smart way to protect the farm for the next generation. Wanted to talk a little bit about Hudson Valley farms. Is everybody here from the Hudson Valley? Yeah. So everybody here probably defines the Hudson Valley region a little bit differently. I live in the southern part of Rensselaer County, so I cut the Hudson Valley off at Albany. So that's how I got these figures. But there are different maps for different purposes. So for my purposes, which may be different than yours, there are about 2,838 farms in the Hudson Valley. And I did include Sullivan County and Rockland County and Putnam County. What's interesting when you look at the demographics of our farms in this area, we've seen a dramatic loss of farms. Only Columbia County and, interestingly enough, Putnam County have increased in their farmer numbers. And when you look at Putnam County, it's the very small farms that are really coming into Putnam County and starting up operations there. So if anybody here is from Putnam, you guys can stop me later and tell me how you're doing it. So every other Hudson Valley county, though, and this is very distressing to us as a state organization, it should certainly be distressing to those of you in this room, every other Hudson Valley county has lost farm members. So for my organization as a statewide one, we really want to engage in a lot more conversations with our members, a lot more conversations with our policy members for how do we turn that number around for the Hudson Valley and the rest of the state. What causes the loss of farms in our state, and what causes, frankly, that stress that I've talked about? What causes that discouragement when we live in a time where we have tremendous opportunity for agriculture, but also tremendous challenges? So, how many of you guys are farmers in the room? I know there are a couple of you. So quite a few, actually. You guys know even better than I do, but the overall economics of farming today are still largely unchanged from time immemorial. When the price of a product goes up for farmers, you plant too much of it. And so the price then starts to go down. And that seems to be the tragic situation that we've had in agriculture for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Overall, when we look at weather patterns, particularly in the Hudson Valley, we've seen that they're becoming far stranger than they ever have before. You know, I can remember back in 90s when we had hailstorms, and that was unusual. And hailstorms affecting the apple crop in the Hudson Valley region are no longer all that unusual, unfortunately. Farmers are still price takers, not price makers, even in certain niche markets, because even if you're selling an apple in a green market, you are still constrained by what the price of that apple is in your local grocery store in terms of how much additional your consumer will want to buy it. What's really interesting to me too is that we have to look at our wine industry, which is the topic of such great policymaker focus right now. But we always hear from our consumers about our price points being too high. So I pulled up on the internet Zacky's Liquor Store, which I think is in Westchester, and their top-rated Finger Lakes Riesling is Perlenweimer Finger Lakes Riesling, great wine, $16.99. But the South African Chenin Blanc, they don't make a Riesling that I can find, was $13.99. So when a consumer walks into a liquor store and sees the price point of a New York wine versus the price point of a South African wine, the people in this room are probably going to pick the Finger Lakes wine, right? At least I hope so. But your normal, average, everyday person who's just looking for a bottle of white wine is probably going to pick up the South African wine. And the point that I'm trying to make, perhaps not that well in telling this story, is that the reason why I picked South Africa has to do with an article I was reading in The Economist a couple weeks ago, where they had this little text box blurb and they were talking about some of the things that were happening in the labor markets. And so in South Africa winery scene, right now the unions and the farm workers are protesting because the farm workers aren't getting paid enough. So the unions are out there advocating for workers, which is the role of unions, and saying we need to see a 50% increase in what laborers in vineyards are being paid. And let's think about this price point, where the South African wines are outcompeting our New York wineries on price point right now. Anybody take a guess on how much you would make if you were a winery farm worker or a vineyard worker for one day? Got a guess? What? $20? Nope, $8 a day. So people are protesting, rightly so, looking for a 50% increase in the wage rate of a worker who's now getting paid $8 a day to harvest grapes in South Africa. And when you look at the price points on that screen, those are the competitive pressures that are making our farmer members stressed, not just in the what we would call luxury goods market or the farm-based fun products like wines, beers, and distillates, but it's also in products like apples, dairy, vegetables. The fact that we have a global economy and global economics sets our prices for how we grow things in New York State is one of the main reasons why our farmers are so stressed. Farmers are also stressed because while most consumers think farmers are really cool these days, they also have an awful lot of value judgments on how they want you to farm. And this is something that the farmers in this room are very familiar with. From New York Farm Bureau's perspective, we don't care whether you're conventional or organic. We don't care whether you're large, medium, or small. We care that you're farming. However, a lot of consumers are caring more and more about how farmers are producing their food. And they have a lot of different judgments. And most people have not grown up on a farm and frankly really don't know how to produce food. So that is a source of some stress. So New York's farming climate is really a mixed bag. When we look at farming in New York State, again, we have just such a great opportunity right now. Close proximity to these wonderful markets that we see in New York City and our other upstate cities as well. We have access to water. This is very, very important. And in fact, I was talking to a Texas Farm Bureau colleague of mine. And you know, the Texans are always very tall, and they wear these cowboy hat and their cowboy boots, and they talk with these really drawly accents. But you know, this Texas Farm Bureau guy who looked so tough was almost in tears, and he was talking to me about the status of some of his farmer members who have now gone through a 3 to 4 year drought cycle and have sold a lot of their cattle, and their ranch lands are no longer sustainable because of the fact that they've had such a bad drought for so many years. So access to water in the Northeast, even though last year we would have had a little bit too much water, is really an important factor that we can't ever take for granted. We also have access to land, and I understand that access to land is limited regionally in in the lower Hudson Valley and also in Long Island, but as a state, overall, we do have access to farmland. We have increasing access to food processors. We have Chobani, obviously wanting to buy a lot more New York milk. We have a lot of farmers markets. One interesting trivia for you is that New York State actually has more winter farmers markets than any other state in the nation, which I think is fun, and evidence of how our consumers really do support New York agriculture. We have, for the first time ever, hopefully, and I'm going to knock wood and cross my fingers, the possibility of immigration reform, which would be great for our farm workers and for our farmers. But the costs of farming in New York State are really, again, why farmers are so stressed. And those of you who are farmers in this room know that better than anybody else in this room. But New York has exceptionally high transportation costs. It's not just the gas that consumers pay when they fill up their cars, but the gas that makes our tractors go. It's also the cost of our thruway tolls, our bridge tolls. Our transportation costs to get product to market are quite prohibitive. We also have very strict water quality standards. This is a very good thing in New York State that we have good water quality standards, but it is a double-edged sword because it's very expensive to pay for meeting water quality compliance. And that's why we've always been happy to work with the environmental community on things like the non-point source protection program and the Environmental Protection Fund. Our real property taxes are seriously out of whack with the rest of the nation. And here's an interesting statistic for you guys to remember. So the national average cost per acre for farmland of your real property taxes is $6.81. So if you're a farmer nationally, you're paying $6.81 for farmland real property tax. If you're a farmer in New York State, our average for 1 acre of farmland is $26. So again, $6 versus $26. And that's even with the wonderful agricultural assessment program that we have. So that is a really serious burden on our farm families today. New York's farm payroll is also very high when you compare it to farmers in other states. And the interesting thing is that this is also a good thing. It's a sign that farmers are concerned about their farm worker employees, but it's also a sign that we still have very high cost structure in New York State. So of the top 10 agricultural states, New York ranks 27th in the nation in terms of our agricultural protection. But of the top 10 ag states, New York ranks second in the nation in terms of our payroll costs, which again is a very serious pocketbook issue. Why am I boring you with all these different statistics and talking about how costly it is to farm? I am because I want to try and make a point that one of our roles at New York Farm Bureau is to talk about not just the fun things, like how to open up new markets for fish farmers, how to do a farm brewery license, one of my personal favorites, or how to open up more markets for our winery and distillery producers, but it's also to focus on the issues that aren't necessarily all that fun or all that easy to engage in conversation. Because the more time that our farmers spend filing paperwork, the less time they have to be out in their fields. And the more mandates and the more cost we have in New York State for our farmers, the less easy it is for them to stay in business. And that's particularly acute, perhaps in the Hudson Valley, where you see even higher costs than we see for some of our farmers in other parts of the state. Long Island as well has the same problem, and that's why farm numbers have decreased over time. So I did want to talk a little bit about New York Farm Bureau. Again, we advocate for all of our farmer members in New York State, and I did just want to put in a plug for the fact that it's really important to recognize that we're all in it together. And so from our perspective in New York Farm Bureau, we have to advocate for everybody, not just conventional, not just organic, not just small, medium, or large sizes of farms. When we look at the agricultural statistics, 20% of our farms produce 80% of the food grown in New York State. Again, that's 20% of our farms are producing 80% of the food grown in New York State. So if we care about keeping food affordable in our communities, we have to care about the larger farms from a food perspective. But from a diversity perspective, and from an importance of how great this agricultural state is in New York State, we need the smaller farms just as much as we need the larger farms. And one very important reason why we need the smaller farms is because it also makes all the agricultural infrastructure work. Because if you don't have a core critical mass of farmers of all sizes, then all the infrastructure that supports the farm community, from the hardware store to the seed supplier, to the fertilizer dealers and everybody else on down the road, they start to disappear. And then it becomes harder and harder for farmers to stay in business. So the interesting thing about working for New York Farm Bureau is that as a farmer member organization, you know, I always say that our small farmers think that we represent only the large guys, and our large farmers think that we represent only the small guys. So it's kind of an interesting situation to be in, and I think it's probably human nature. But one of the points that I wanted to make to this group, and it's one of the things that came up in our breakout discussion this morning, is how important it is that we make sure that we're all advocating for everybody to stay in farming. So what is our challenge today? New York Farm Bureau as an organization, our whole mission and the reason for us being here is to serve and strengthen all of New York agriculture. We're run by our farm families. We are run by those who take the time to show up at our county meetings and who take the time to show up at our state meetings. We don't go after any grant funding or any state funding. And our goal is really to keep farmers farming. But one of the things that has become particularly evident to me over the years, particularly as my main role in life is to serve as a lobbyist for farmers, is that we can't do it just on our own anymore. Because the farming community in New York State is too small, numbers speaking, to only be advocating for ourselves without engaging our communities and without engaging other people. So from our perspective within our organization, we're realizing more and more that our farmer members really need to start engaging with their neighbors a little bit more. Not just because it's important that when a new neighbor comes into the farm community, they realize that if that tractor goes down the road at 5 o'clock in the morning during the springtime, they won't call the farmer and start yelling at them because they woke them up, right? And hopefully we're having enough conversations as a community so that we can realize that we'll live with a few smells of the farm operation during the springtime as well. And one of the things that we've been doing in New York Farm Bureau is try to get out more and try to make sure that our farmers are actually speaking and having conversations with different groups and talking to them about the importance of farming in New York State and the importance of being a good neighbor and supporting our communities. But I think overall what our board has given our staff as a directive is not just to worry about maintaining those farm numbers. If you remember the first slide that we talked about with the 36,000 farms, we're realizing that 36,000 farms is great that we haven't lost any, but in our organization, we'd much rather have a vision where we can start measuring success by seeing that number start to increase and start to creep up over time. Because we really strongly feel that we need to increase the number of farms that we have in New York State and certainly our usage of all of our available farmland. And it's no longer acceptable for us in our organization or us to just keep kind of looking at each other, doing the same thing that we've been doing for years and seeing the farm community shrink. So we'd like to see at New York Farm Bureau a concerted effort to start growing those farmer numbers. So what's on our Farm Bureau state agenda? One of the things that I think it's important to talk about is ways we can help the farm community stay viable in New York State as an industry, as a community, and some of the important people who help us make this community survive are actually our legislators. Up there you'll see a picture of the Independent Democratic Caucus last year with a farmer member, Peter Tennick, from Albany County, who you may know. He was there supporting a Dine New York, Shop New York, Market New York bill. This is very fun for us and an exciting possibility in the farm community because it gives our restaurants and our grocery stores like Hannaford, who had their marvelous Close to Home project, an opportunity to take advantage of New York's Marketing and Pride of New York program. So we were pretty excited about this initiative. It's one of the things that we hope will go forward with this year, and I encourage those of you who are so inclined to call them legislators and support it. We're also working on that Taste New York initiative too, because it's important that we promote New York agriculture and help get our message out to a broader community. One of the things that we're working on as well is how to increase donations of food to our food banks in New York State. I'm pretty proud of our Young Farmer program. New York for many years has been first place in the nation in terms of the amount of food that our members and led by our young farmers have been donating to food banks. Last year, in a year when we had 50% of our normal apple crop, we actually donated over 8 million tons of product. A lot of that was in response to Hurricane Sandy. That's a phenomenal number, especially when you consider the devastation we had in our apple crop last year. So one of the things that's on our agenda this year is to try to secure a little bit of financial relief for our farmers who make the decision to donate products. Very important because we see a lot of farmers who are very willing to donate food that's grown that might not have a home, but it's very difficult to pay for the labor costs to pick it and the packaging costs and the transportation costs. So that's something that we're really working on this year. We're also working on reducing the cost of farming in New York because really for us, the goal is to, again, grow farm numbers, and in order to keep our farms sustainable, we have to keep them profitable. So we have to start working on reducing the cost of farming. So we're working on an ag assessment tax cap, working again on transitioning to the next generation of farms in New York State. This is something we'll be working on a lot more because we see the average age of the farmer has gone from about 55 to 57. So how do we bridge that gap, encourage younger people to get in, and most importantly, encourage them to be able to afford getting into the next farm, particularly in this Hudson Valley and also Long Island area. So we're working on increasing the estate tax exemption because again, in the Hudson Valley and Long Island area of our state, particularly with your higher value land costs, it's very, very difficult for the next generation to transition in. Also continuing to work on regulatory barriers and some transportation issues as well. On our national agenda, immigration reform remains probably our top priority. In fact, of the two priorities, immigration reform and farm bill, we are working on immigration reform just as much, if not harder, on the farm bill right now, because we really see this as a tremendous opportunity. We need to regularize the visa status of people who are working on our farms right now, currently without legitimate documentation. And we also need a seasonal temporary program that works. The interesting thing about our farms is that the lack of immigration reform has really been stalling the normal migration patterns, which we see on our New York farms right now. If it weren't for the lack of immigration reform, the next demographic that would move into our farms is actually Hispanic and Latino farms, and we've seen that effort stymied because of the lack of immigration reform. And that's one of the main reasons why this issue is so very important to us. The next issue we're working on nationally is the farm bill. You guys lived through Irene and Lee, so you know what a devastation a hurricane can cause to our farm families. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do, particularly for our organic and very diversified vegetable and fruit farms in New York, is to try to get a crop insurance program that works. Because the reality of the farm bill is that a lot of the funding in it that goes to agriculture goes to those 4 program crops: corn, cotton, soybeans, and I'm drawing a blank on the 4th one. But at any rate, what we have to do is get crop insurance that actually works for our members and that will steer some of the federal resources into an insurance program that will help our diversified vegetable and fruit farms so that in the event of another storm loss that we saw in Irene and Lee, we actually have a way to get our members some assistance. We're also working on a similar concept for the dairy sector of agriculture. One of the things that's really lacking in the Farm Bill right now, because it was extended, but a lot of the programs that weren't funded, frankly, are the environmental programs. So we're very concerned that the extension of the Farm Bill, and depending upon what happens in Washington, D.C., which the news from Washington, D.C. is certainly not that optimistic these days, but one of the things that we're very concerned about is the loss of EQIP funding and farmland protection funding, because that is currently left out of the extension of the Farm Bill. Nutrition programs are also a concern. So, but a little bit beyond policy, it really will take communities working together in order to keep farmers farming locally. And that is the main point of this whole conference, and again, why I was excited to be here today, because it's very different to be addressing an audience where it's not just farmers, but it's farmers talking to consumers, farmers talking to environmentalists, farmers talking to policymakers. It will take a lot of support from our state institutions and our businesses being willing to support local farms, and perhaps just as, if not more significantly as important, being willing to support efforts that either reduce the cost of farming in New York State or give farmers a little bit more of a profit or a premium for producing locally. It'll also take understanding, again, of the basic cost structure that we face in New York for our members, and again, tying it back to the beginning, that is why farmers are so stressed in New York State. So I didn't know if you guys wanted time for any questions, but I'd be more than happy to take any questions rather than just talking.